In school, most American children are told briefly about Japanese-American incarceration. The years during World War II when our country rounded up innocent Americans and sent them to camps. In textbooks, this history is often presented as an isolated example of war hysteria, the exception that proves the rule of a generous and forgiving nation. But if you talk to survivors and descendants, you'll hear a warning. Our traditions and our Constitution are fragile whenever hate and fear take control. After the Japanese military bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American generals, elected officials, and members of the public urged President Franklin Roosevelt to take swift and aggressive action. They argued that the enemy was not only across the Pacific Ocean, but also close to home. Immigrants from Japan had faced discrimination since they first arrived in the United States. Now, many of their fellow Americans viewed these immigrants as a threat to national security. President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 in February 1942. The order authorized the incarceration of more than 120,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry. 2/3 were American citizens. The U.S. government constructed camps to hold them, starting in California with Manzanar, now a National Historic Site. I met Rose Masters, a ranger at the site, to learn how this place came to be.
People were looking at this site here at Manzanar as early as that executive order was signed, mid-February. And near the beginning of March, you had a construction company from Los Angeles coming up, bulldozing this landscape and starting to build barracks where Japanese Americans would live.
It's a beautiful place, but it doesn't seem the most obvious place to build a camp. What was the logic?
The government was looking for some specific things. One of them was get them away from population centers, very isolated locations. We're standing between two 14,000-foot high mountain ranges. There was a water source here. That would be the snow melt from the Sierras. And there was a train line that came from Los Angeles and ended at Lone Pine, California, just 9 miles south of here. The military went around hanging civilian exclusion orders. Those stated to people of Japanese ancestry that they needed to go to a certain place at a certain time, that they could only bring a few items, what they could carry. And they were brought to places that the government was calling temporary assembly centers. Manzanar was called Owens Valley Reception Center at first.
Reception center.
It sounds like a very nice place, but indeed when the first people arrived here, they did not find a place that was particularly welcoming in any way.
When Japanese Americans arrived at Manzanar, they were assigned to barracks, living quarters that the military built quickly, with no insulation from the near-constant wind and dust. Rose showed me recreated barracks that help illustrate the conditions that new arrivals faced. So were these divided by family?
You would wish that were the case, because that would provide more privacy. But in fact, the ruling was that initially when people were coming into Manzanar, there had to be 8 people per room. And it led to some awkward situations. You had families living with bachelors or newly married couples living with little kids that they weren't related to.
I don't see restroom facilities in the building. Is it separate buildings?
Correct,
Yeah.
yes. And those were shared facilities. You had one latrine building for women, one latrine building for men. And those toilets had no partitions between them initially. Huge shock to people, huge shock. Imagine also how many people, over 10,000 people in less than 1 square mile. People started building furniture out of scrap lumber that was left over from the construction of the camp. Sometimes they would build privacy screens, make it a little more formal, put up curtains, just try to make it more like a home and less like an army barracks.
It seems that it must have taken just incredible reserves of character and determination and love for each other to sustain this. I mean, what kind of strategies do they use to survive this?
we've done about 600 interviews in our oral history collection, and nobody's ever said the same thing.
That's
You know, they have the same thing happen to them, but the way that they handled it personally is different. Some people handled it through shikataganai. It's a Japanese phrase that means it cannot be helped. We've heard that a lot of Issei, those first generation immigrants, would frequently say that. Other people handled it through the opposite extreme, protesting against what was happening to them, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in very outspoken ways. There has been long-lasting, deep-set psychological trauma for some people from what was done to them.
Mary Nomura was incarcerated at Manzanar. She arrived when she was 16 years old. Even at that young age, Mary and her siblings had already experienced hardship and shown great resilience. Mary is 94 now, and she welcomed me to her home in Los Angeles to share her story.
I was born in Southern California.
Right.
My mother and father are from Japan, and they started life here in Southern California in 1900, and they had five children? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 children. And my mother was a musician. She started a music school. She played the Japanese instruments. She played many instruments. And then she taught classical Japanese dancing, and she taught classical opera-type singing. I used to listen to them surreptitiously and learn all those parts. And then I sang it one day, and my mother was surprised, and she put me on the stage. And so I was 5 years old when I first appeared on stage, and I sang all those parts that I just learned from listening to them.
Sadly, Mary had little time with her parents. Her father passed when Mary was 4, and her mother died 4 years later. Mary's older siblings dropped out of school to raise the family. After Pearl Harbor, the future grew only more uncertain.
My brother said, we all have to go to a camp. We're all going to be taken away from the Pacific Coast to be put into a camp. Oh, great, get to go to a camp. I didn't know what a camp was. I thought it was, for dine and dandy. So
What did you carry?
We couldn't afford suitcases. So my eldest sister, who was already married, went out and bought some canvas ticking, made duffel bags, and we put all our belongings in there. And we met at an area in Venice where I lived, boarded a rickety old bus, and we took it must have been 8 hours or more to get to the campsite. Looked out the bus window, and it's just a sea of black tar paper barracks. What is this? This is camp, And I said, how long do we have to stay here? Where do we go from here? And we just got off the bus, and we had to walk to the warehouse. So here's some canvas bags, fill it with straw. Okay, so we had to fill it with straw. Now drag it to this building and that block, whatever. We found out that those were our mattresses on army cots. That was to be our bed. And one khaki-colored wool blanket. And so that night, I cried. I really cried. This is what camp is? I had no idea.
Mary attended school at Manzanar. She also carried on her mother's love of music, earning the nickname, the Songbird of Manzanar.
I sang for weddings and camp dances and, just for fun. I just sang all the time.
That sounds like a great blessing. Life would have been harder without that gift, wouldn't it?
I don't know about the gift, but I'm just a ham, and they ask me to sing, I'll sing. But my way I'm just an easygoing person, and so I know that wasn't right, what happened, and I know how terrible it was for most people, but I guess I never harbored bad thoughts about people, never. What the government did to all of us, it was not forgivable, but I didn't keep harping on it.
Did you know other people who did?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So my husband would always say, let them vent it out, let them do that. I can't do that, he said, because I could only stay if it wasn't for that camp, and we never would have met, and we never would have had these children. So that's how he always said it. So that's the way I always said it, too. So not that because he said it, but that's how I felt.
In Los Angeles, the gleaming Japanese-American National Museum tells the long history of people of Japanese ancestry in the United States, starting with immigration to Hawaii in the 1860s. I visited the museum to explore the surprising history of images of incarceration during World War II. The experiences of leaving homes and trying to adjust to life at the camps were well documented in photographs, but many of those photographs were sequestered from public view. The War Relocation Authority hired Dorothea Lange, hoping her photos would demonstrate that Roosevelt's order was carried out humanely. When her work actually showed pain and chaos, the government seized her photos. Ansel Adams, who is friends with the director of Manzanar, took portraits of incarcerees and published them in a book with a defiant title, Born Free and Equal. That book was quickly pulled from shelves and destroyed. Toyo Miyatake, a Japanese-born photographer incarcerated at Manzanar, snuck photography equipment into the camp and took photos in secret. A present-day photographer, Paul Kitagaki Jr., has breathed new life into these once-hidden photos. He has worked for more than a decade to recover the lost names and lost stories behind these faces. Paul and his subjects returned to the places where Lange, Adams, and Miyatake first captured moments of pain, confusion, and loss to take new portraits. Paul joined me to offer a tour of a powerful special exhibit of his work.
I wanted to know the backstory because I didn't learn about this until 1970. I was 16 years old in high school, taking my history class, and my folks had never spoken about this.
Wow.
And so
And
when
this was here in California.
California,
Yeah.
right. And so when I learned about it, I went home and asked, what the heck?
Yeah. More or less.
More or less, yeah. And I really wanted to know what happened. They really didn't talk about it too much, still.
That frustration from his high school years stuck with Paul and ultimately inspired this project. He told me the story of Mitsuko Jimoto, one of some 33,000 Japanese Americans who served in the armed forces during World War II.
I was really lucky because this is photographed in the exact same spot where Dorothy Lange had photographed him in 1942. And at the time he was about 19, he was leaving San Francisco, and he felt that he'd taken all his American history classes, all your rights as a citizen, and he was like, where's all those teachers and everybody who told me, we have all these rights, these civil liberty rights, where are they? Where's everybody? And he really felt let down and betrayed by his country.
Sure.
He joined the Japanese American 442nd. He served in Italy and France, and he was a staff sergeant, and he won a Bronze Star for his bravery. He just wanted to show that we're loyal Americans, and that's why he wanted to join.
Was all the 442nd people who were coming from the camps?
Yeah, most of the four guys from 442nd were all from the camps.
So do you think, talking to them, that you can understand their motivations? I mean, at this distance, it seems like the last thing you'd want to do is to serve the country that had treated you so shamefully.
Yeah, there was people that didn't want to do that because they felt they were American citizens, they weren't being treated right. Other guys that felt that this is what we had to do to prove our loyalty for the whole community.
Wow. Was he eager to be in your photo?
Yes, because he felt that sense of history, and that stories needed to be recorded and told stories so the stories aren't lost for the future generations. So he really felt a need for being involved.
Did you grow weary during this? It seems like a prolonged and complicated process.
No, I'm still finding people. I'm still looking for people before they're all gone, before they can't tell their story anymore.
In 1969, as the nation burned with calls for rights and freedoms for all Americans, a group of Japanese American college students decided they would explore their own history, a history barely spoken of by their parents and grandparents. The students traveled to a place they had heard of but not seen, Manzanar, by now abandoned, its buildings dismantled and sold off. Among the students was Sue Embry, who had gone back to school in her 40s to finish her degree. Sue had been incarcerated at Manzanar, and this was the first time she had returned. That trip in 1969 grew into an annual pilgrimage, and that pilgrimage grew into a determined effort to have Manzanar become a site of remembrance and reflection. Sue Embry died in 2006. I talked with her son Bruce, an ally in the decades-long struggle in the home they had shared in Los Angeles. I met Bruce as he prepared to lead the 50th annual pilgrimage, an act that is now his family's legacy. So your mother must have been unusual in the sense to have been both a survivor and an activist, right?
She was very unusual. And after the Manzanar pilgrimage, she spoke to the media and began to explain to the LA Times what the significance of this site is. The backlash was swift and vitriolic. I don't want to say vicious, but there was a tremendous backlash within the Japanese community.
Oh, really?
Against anyone who dared speak of this. Don't bring it up.
Let's move on.
Let's move on. We've moved on. We've reestablished, you know, not only don't rock the boat, but how dare you? Right. You threaten us. You threaten our prosperity. You threaten our place in America. And I think that after the pilgrimage, they realized they needed to do something to really tell people what happened, that this was a special place. So they immediately set about forming what was known as the Manzanar Project, known as the Manzanar Committee. And the first thing they wanted to do was they wanted to lobby to make Manzanar a state historic landmark. So they promptly set about writing some terminology for a plaque. They wrote some nice little, you know, just in the plaque is actually right there on the wall. Right. The commission argued that it should not be a state landmark because the state of California did not create the concentration camp. The federal government did. So my mother said, oh, thanks for the suggestion. So I don't think they even understood, you know, back then, they had no grand plan. They were going at it year by year and taking things as they came.
And I think this is important for us to remember because sometimes people will say, well, gee, and you put up a plaque, you know, who cares about that? But it turns out that this is a stake in the ground, right? And the words matter.
Right.
And everything followed from this acknowledgement of what this place was.
She said, you know, Manzanar was the ultimate negation of democracy. But it can be more. It can be a monument to the strength of our democracy and the resilience of our spirit as a country. And they passed the legislation in 1992, and Manzanar becomes a national site. And in the legislation, my mother wanted to make sure that there was community input from the Native Americans in the Owens Valley, the Paiute Shoshone. She wanted to make sure that the residents of the valley who came after the Native Americans, the white farmers and their descendants and ranchers and oilmen were represented. So every step of the way, Manzanar and the story of Manzanar was told by the people who were there, who were essentially, it was told by the victims of the crime.
She didn't do it in the fastest possible means, perhaps, but in the most inclusive means.
Right.
Again, it seems very ahead of its time. Did she live to see?
She did. She actually spoke at the grand opening in 2004. It was her last speech at Manzanar. You know, she said Manzanar was the ultimate negation of democracy, and I think she lived to see that her government live up to her expectations.
In the 1980s, while Sue Embry and her allies worked to make Manzanar a site of remembrance and education, fellow organizers and other Japanese-American activists began to call for redress and reparations from the U.S. government. They called on Congress and the President to form a commission and hold hearings that would publicly document the treatment of Japanese Americans. 500 survivors testified, many speaking out for the first time. I met one of the key people who led that charge, Kathy Masaoka. She told me that the movement for redress had roots not only in World War II, but also in grim realities of the 1980s.
We had a drug problem in the community. Young people in high school were overdosing in drugs, and we connected that to the camp experience, that denial, that hatred of yourself, and not knowing who you are, because none of us learned it in school. We didn't study Asian American history, Japanese American history. We didn't study about the camps.
Wow.
So of course people were confused. and so many young people were overdosing in that year.
So this seems to be something that the Japanese American advocacy community sort of developed for itself, this idea of redress.
I think so, although I have to give credit to the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, for trying to get citizenship for the first generation Issei, our grandparents, and starting those kind of motions. I mean, they were, trying to make right some of the wrongs that had been committed against the Japanese American. So I think it was kind of a natural flow.
Right.
And also, of course, because of civil rights, I think people started to think, what kinds of things happen to our community? What can we do to, repair or to stand up for ourselves as well?
After the hearings, the Commission's report concluded that the relocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans was a grave injustice. The cause was prejudice and failures of leadership, not military necessity. The report put pressure on Congress to act.
Those that were surviving when the bill was signed, August 10th, 1988, those were the people that were eligible to receive the redress, who had been incarcerated in the camps. And so we thought, 120,000, maybe half of the people, there'd be 60,000. It ended up to be closer to a little over 80,000 people. And so they received $20,000 and an apology. And for some, especially the older people, the first generation Issei, the apology, I think, meant more to them, because the money at that point in their life could have been helpful, for some of them, but many of them, I think, just wanted the government to apologize.
Kathy introduced me to a playwright, Tracy Katakitayama, who recently premiered a new work, Tales of Clamor. It's inspired by the hearings that did so much to persuade Congress to pass legislation for redress and reparations. Tracy is part of the next generation of activists keeping memory alive. I asked her, how did she come to feel so strongly about telling this story today?
I credit a lot to my parents. They were the ones who, when I was a kid, they said, hey, we're gonna take you outside of Torrance, we're gonna take you to Little Tokyo, we're gonna take you to meetings and conferences, and we're gonna take you to Manzanar. And when we get to these places—
Words that kids love. We're gonna take you to meetings and conferences, right?
Yeah, I was like, I don't know, okay. And so they said, when we get to these places, you need to pay attention and you need to talk to people who are a lot older than you. You need to talk to people of different generations, and especially your elders, because they're dying and they're going away, and you need to ask them questions. I think the first time I stepped onto Manzanar, I was like 10 or 11 years old, and I would go every year and help organize buses with them. And I could see over the years fewer and fewer survivors showing up. And there's this plot of land like 100 yards in back of the cemetery at Manzanar. They used to have this one area where there was this huge pond of broken dishes. So after they closed the camps, the mess halls dumped all of these dishes, and they got uncovered over time, and it was sort of our ritual to go and pay our respects at the cemetery and then walk back to that pond of dishes. And I think something about holding those pieces and thinking about like just the most basic thing, right, that we do, we eat every day. And I remember thinking, like, of all the other people in like the current time, the present time, that are struggling in ways in which we can understand. Like we have actual like physical, visceral reactions to this daily ritual that we do of eating and eating together. And if I can't see that this is like connected to right now and other people's struggles now, then I'm really not listening to what my parents are telling me. I'm not paying attention.
At the 50th anniversary of the Manzanar pilgrimage, Bruce, Kathy, and Tracy gathered with fellow activists and descendants. For them, family memories of incarceration speak not only to the 1940s and not only to Japanese Americans. They stand in solidarity with communities that are marginalized and persecuted today because of their religion or immigration status. Sue Embry and her allies wanted Manzanar to be a monument to democracy and a symbol of what goes wrong when the rights of innocent people are ripped away. As thousands gather at Manzanar, they share their stories and they make a declaration. What happened here shall never happen again.